position. That doesn't, yeah, okay. I don't know, is anyone watching the YouTube stream? I feel like it should have Zoom up, but there might be an audio issue. Does anyone know?
Stream is playing pre-meeting audio and video.
Okay. Yeah, okay. As far as I can tell, it should be streaming the Zoom screen. Maybe I can try this. Let's see what this does.
It is a
As
screen.
far as I
It
can
is
tell,
a no.
yeah, okay. Let's try this. It's a little wonky, but I think this will do. So, yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, this is going to be annoying. Hmm. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. I can try just to do this. So, there's the agenda. This is consensus layer call 134. And yeah, we have quite a bit to talk about with Electra, so let's just go ahead and dive into it. Um, Actually, let me just check one thing, because what I don't know is if this is staying on Zoom. Yeah, okay. This is just really lagging. Hmm. Okay, sorry everyone. Yeah, but okay. Anyway, we'll go ahead and get started. I guess this is what I want to know. Okay, that's gonna be weird, but that's okay. Um, yeah, the first thing is just to recap DevNote Zero, and all of the things that interop. So maybe just to get started, we had an open question with EIP 7549, essentially how to handle attestations at the fork boundary. And after discussions with the various client teams, we just decided to keep that as is. So that was pretty easy. Let's see, next up, we can go ahead and move to EIP 7251. So this is MaxEV. And yeah, I mean, I think generally things went pretty well. There was a DevNet Zero. I think all of the CL client teams joined and it went pretty well, given it was the first DevNet. That being said, yeah, there were like a few things to consider, with MaxCB, one of them being consolidations. So we kind of said originally we were going to aim for EL consolidations. I don't know if anyone has thought any more about this or how we want to handle this. I think later on the call we'll discuss fork scoping, and I think some people have even suggested taking consolidations out. Obviously, that makes the feature a little bit less useful, but that's an option on the table. Um, yeah, does anyone have any thoughts here on this one? Just having EL triggered consolidations?
I think yes, sorry. I think Lighthouse had some alpha implementation that Mark was hacking on. I think he had a fork that had the API as well. But I'm not sure if anyone else tried tackling consolidations.
I'm not sure Mark's status on it, but I know he did like a polling of um, applications to see whether they prefer EL or CL triggered consolidations, and there's definitely support for EL. And yeah, I think we should include them if we can.
Okay, sounds good. So I don't know if we want to aim for DevNet 1 for that or something later, but yeah, let's just keep that in mind.
I can briefly provide the status from the EL side. So we have the smart contract for EL triggered consolidations. It works. One question, kind of the next natural step would be to outline the EL spec for them. And before doing this, I'd like us to come through the proposal of treating EL triggered requests as a sidecar to make a decision here, because it can affect the spec of this thing on the EL side. So this kind of on a critical path to outlining the spec for EL triggered consolidations. And for consolidations in general, I think that was agreed that we want them, and we want them triggered from EL. So
Yeah, sounds good.
Does someone have maybe an overview on how complicated the EL triggered consolidations would be from I don't know, from a CL or EL implementation perspective?
Like, so I haven't worked directly on it, but I think it's about as like it's very similar to any other EL triggered operation. So since we already have like an idea of how to do this, it's not really that much extra work.
Right, so we'll need the logic for consolidations either way, assuming we have the feature, and then the source, if it's EL or CL, doesn't make too much difference. I think if anything, EL is simpler. Okay, so let's move on to something else then. Sounds like we're pretty much in agreement there. The next thing, just to round up some of the DevNet Zero stuff, was this. Let's see. So there was a question around handling deposit finalization with EIP 6110. Let's see if I can grab the link to this comment here. Again, there were like various conversations at Interop, and Mikhail summarized, I think, generally the path forward here in this comment I just linked in the chat. So yeah, update is just generally we move forward on that some, and you can check out the comment for the details. So from there, let's see. The other stuff is going to be additions to Electra. Was there any other DevNet Zero things or stuff from the interop that people wanted to bring up, kind of around the existing stuff?
Yeah, I actually had something that was related to the get payload bodies requests in the execution engine API. So the V1 and V2 versions of these are both fully backwards compatible. So I was thinking we might as well just extend the V1 rather than adding V2. Yeah, just a thought.
Is that in line with how we usually handle this? I'd have to go look at the comment to say more.
I think. Well, so with this particular endpoint, we use it during sync, and the like types we're getting are going to change at forks, and be better not to like switch at boundaries. So I think that's why it's specified as fully backwards compatible. Um, with other endpoints, think we usually do actually increment the version as the type changes. So it's kind of different in that sense. I guess from my point of view though, like if this one's specified as backwards compatible, we might as well not increment the version.
Yeah, so adding a bit the context on this, we usually bump the version as Sean said, and makes sense because usually either the new fork and the new logic should be applied. The new logic is implemented by this new version, or the structure. It's just the mostly about the fork, but with this method, it's kind of fork agnostic and used splicing, as Sean mentioned already. So we could bump the version. We could add a new structure, but the structure would have a couple or three more new fields that will just be set to null for those blocks that do not have withdrawal requests, for instance. So probably it'd just be easier to keep the same version and just extend the structure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. If everyone would take a look, just go ahead and chime in on I think this is a PR there. Yeah, 545 in the execution APIs repo. Okay. So from there were a number of agenda items raised for Electra. Essentially, either changing the EAPs we have, and even some new ones. So let's just start with the ones that were changing the existing included EIPs. So first up, we have this PR here. It's 3768 in the consensus specs. And essentially, it's just changing the order of the fields of the new committee bits. So let's see. I think who raised this? Eton. I don't know if Eton's on the call.
I'm here.
Cool. Do you want to give some just a quick overview?
Yeah, it's about stability for generalized indices. So when we add a new field in the middle of a container, it means that the subsequent fields get assigned a new index, which breaks proofs based on EIP 4788 in the EL. And it's also a bit misleading the way how committee bits originally were placed before the signature. It sort of suggests that the signature signs over them, but that's not the case. The signature in the attestation only signs over data. So that's why I suggested to move the new field to the end to avoid both of these problems. And there is also a comment in the same PR that suggests that we should also consider a new name for the aggregation bits because we changed the length on that list. And if we reuse the old name but change the type, it can lead to subtle bugs in implementations that forget to update one of the usages or still consider it based on the old length. So yeah, it's a small thing, mostly for interoperability and forward compatibility.
Yeah, I love to comment that it kind of breaks this schema pattern we have of having the signature be after everything else. But yeah, I think generally the rationale makes sense. So take a look at the PR but generally, I think it sounds like a good idea.
I'll add just a little note to that, which is that for attestation, maybe it's not the most important thing, but broadly, adding fields at the end of a container allows you to use a trick where you read the common parts with a single deserializer. And this is useful. We use that in blocks, for example, to determine the slot so that we can determine which concrete serializer to use. So it's kind of like always good practice in SSZ to add things at the end, not just for the Merkle stability, but just for general ease of use when trying to upgrade from one object to, or from one container to the other.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the next one, this was, I believe it's suggesting to change how we are handling shuttling all of these EL triggered requests from the EL to the CL. This is PR 551 on execution APIs. Mikhail, you opened this. Would you like to give us an overview?
Yeah, sure. So this proposal, thanks Felix and Lightline for the idea. And this proposal is about to remove deposits and withdrawal requests from the execution layer block. And instead of that, the execution layer client will surface these requests into the response to the get payload method call. After that, the consensus layer will include these requests into the beacon block body. So they are moved kind of like from the EL block to the CL block structure-wise. And then when the new payload method is being called, the requests are dropped, are passed to this method call as a separate parameters, kind of as a sidecar parameters to the payload. And if the EL has fully synced, so it's online and can fully execute a block, it will need to execute a block, obtain those requests from the block execution, and ensure that the requests given from the CL matches the one that are obtained from the execution of the block. It's kind of the way it's supposed to work is kind of similar to block KZG commitments, where we obtain them from the get payload and send versioned hashes in the call to the new payload. The major difference here is that the requests can only be validated when EL is fully synced. But it does not introduce any new assumption in terms of whether whether the CL can or cannot apply deposits and withdrawals during the withdrawal request during the optimistic sync. With respect to the optimistic sync, actually nothing is changing. This proposal does not affect anything. Yeah, that's the description of what is proposed. And it would be great if we think through this and whether we like it or not on the consensus and execution layers side. In my opinion, it's really quite nice design solution, which simplifies the EL part. And I forgot to mention that this is basically an alternative to generalizing requests in the execution layer block. So I'll stop here for any comments or questions.
I commented on it before, like I don't yet understand how the optimistic sync would work in this new proposal, because if you only have a CL alone, how does it know which of these requests are legitimate if they are not part of the EL block hash?
I don't think it changes anything. EL block hash is basically an EL commitment to the data contained in a block. In this case, we just move from EL commitment to the CL commitment, so we'll have them as a part of the beacon block body, and it does not change anything.
But when you receive a block and it contains a couple of these execution layer triggered requests, how do you know as a validator whether these requests are the expected ones, whether they are legit.
If you're in the optimistic sync mode, you can't know that for sure, and you can't know that for sure even with the existing logic.
With the existing logic, you can recompute the MPT and check that it is part of the block hash. And eventually, when the EL syncs up, it can tell you that this chain is invalid.
Actually, yeah, but you can do the same. That the chain can be invalid, even when you're, yeah, even after this change. I don't. Maybe I'm overseeing something, but I don't think that it changes anything. Because today you can't execute, you can't validate that deposits that or withdrawal requests that you have in the execution payload are the same as it would be obtained from the block execution during the optimistic sync. And when the sync is over, so you can tell that again, the block hash commitment does not, a malicious party can produce the valid execution payload in terms of a block hash, but with invalid withdrawal requests included into it.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it yet, but maybe we can follow up in the thread of that PR.
I also understand that if we accept this proposal, then it would probably require some decent amount of engineering efforts to switch from the general request to this approach. Mostly, yeah, on the L side.
What would the EL need to change?
Well, they would need to drop the deposits and withdrawals from the block structure, and they would need to surface this information in the response to the get payload, and also would need to accept this data on the new payload and do this matching after executing a block. So
Okay. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look at this PR. I will soon, and I suggest everyone else to do the same if you have a few moments.
yeah, since this change is kind of like really important for how do we handle requests, it would be great to have it sooner than later if we even want it. If we don't want it, then yeah, then we can just proceed as is. But from my perspective, I don't know if it's worth discussing on the EL call as well. But if anyone from the CL side or EL side or listening to this call can think on it and comment out if they're opposed or not, that would be great.
Yeah, it feels like something we can make a decision on the next CL call. Cool. Let's see. So from here, the rest of the agenda items are discussing new things that we'd want to put in Pectra, which is going to tee us up for a fork scoping conversation, which is probably why you are all here. So the first one I think will be simpler than pure DOS. It's EIP 7688. This is essentially using part of the stable container EIP. We had a conversation about this at Interop, and the basic rationale was essentially we're making these breaking changes with the attestations. If we want this sort of forward compatibility with respect to SSZ layouts, we'll have to make more breaking changes in the future. And so the argument is essentially to make all of the breaking changes now at one time. So, that makes sense. What it implies then, though, is that everyone needs to go and add this new SSZ functionality into their library, which is not a huge ask given the scope of this particular SSZ feature, but it's definitely non-trivial. So yeah, Cayman or Eton, I think you guys were kind of leading the charge on this. Would you like to say anything further?
Sure, Cayman already posted into the chat a link that tracks implementation progress. I hope that I have collected an exhaustive list of all the relevant SSC libraries there. I think the biggest challenge is on the Go one, because fast SSC was a bit of a concern there about its performance and maturity, that the teams there considered making an entire new library instead of just patching the stable container support into it. But yeah, let me know if anything is missing or if you need any guidance. We also have a PR in consensus specs repo that adds a lot of tests, like SSC general tests. And there is also the Remarkable implementation, which also has a PR with even more tests. So there's that. There is Grandine with a hands up.
Yes, so Solus from Grandin team. So one question we have regarding the particular implementations of stable containers. So we are thinking because of the Rust language and essentially of the nature of the Rust language, we are thinking to keep versioned containers at the application. The code essentially. So then in this way we can keep the code safety because otherwise all the or most of the fields will be optional in the structs. And I just wanted to ask, so for more dynamic languages, it's probably not an issue, but for more static languages, was there some research or some some different attempts to implement different way. And is there some some conclusions on that? Because once we get to this stable containers thing, then the structs are it becomes structs full of optional fields, which is not very good in terms of safety that compiler can ensure. So I just wanted to ask, maybe there was some conclusion on this thing there.
Like you have two new things. One is this Merkleization layout, which is indeed full of optionals. But then you also have these profiles, which like have all the fields that are required as required fields. All the fields that are no longer used are completely gone. And you can also keep them as optional if you want. Like sometimes it makes sense, for example, a withdrawal request. When you want to request full withdrawal, then just omit the amount. So in the implementations, I know what you mean. One approach that could be used if you want to avoid copying is that you just wrap it, like you have the internal memory layout, which is full of optionals, but then you have a type safe wrapper that just provides accessors that access directly into this optionals, like into the backing store. But the types that we are discussing here are quite like small, like you don't have to convert them between profiles a lot. And it's more like comparable to when you read something from JSON into SSC, like you first look at what fields are there and decide dynamically which type you need and load it in there. So yeah, would be interesting to see how the different implementations evolve. I think in TypeScript, ironically, they don't even have this type that's full of optionals, but just provide a bit vector that sort of tells you how many holes there are in the Merkleization. So there are different approaches that can be used.
Okay, so we currently we likely will go with the approach where we will keep this versioned containers, and we will see how it evolves. Because at the moment seems that it will be the smallest change needed right now for us, so we can keep with this version of containers like we did before. But we add on top of that we add the stable containers. Yeah, so we will see. But if anyone from more statical languages will have some conclusions on these approaches, I'm happy to hear.
I just posted in the chat an example of what Mac from our team has been working on in Rust. And it's got like the stable container struct with optional fields, but then like 8 times mentioning the profiles that are no optional fields. Yeah, so take a look if you want.
What is the progress right now, just to track like what implementations have already started for the like that was the Rust the Ethereum SSC, right? That library. the
That's
white
what we use in Lighthouse.
Okay. And Grandine, I guess, as well, started looking into it.
Yeah, we have our own SSE implementation, and we started to look how to add the stable container. That's why I was asking here.
What about the Teku library and Fast SSE, or the one that Prism is trying to build?
Tego we haven't started yet. Planning to do it very quickly.
Okay. And Prism?
I don't think we've started yet. Casey would probably be one looking at it.
Okay. Yeah, there's another thing where it will be useful for Verkle, for the optionals there. But if we are considering for 7688 for just to do it now to avoid breaking the smart contracts all the time, then that will be before Verkle, so they can also take advantage of that for the optionals that they need. Okay. Another thing that we have to think about is to go through all the containers that exist right now in the beacon chain. Like there are not that many, maybe 50. And to consider which of them do need future extensibility, which of them could benefit from optionals. Like for example, for deposits, there was a discussion at the interop where this activation eligibility epoch would no longer be useful in the validator struct. So for example, making the validator struct also a stable container would allow to deprecate and remove those unnecessary fields. Yeah, just think about what containers need extensibility, because if we don't do these moves now, then when we later decide to extend them, then it will break again, right? So, yeah.
Right. I mean, the one caveat is we might not know today which needs that in the future, you know?
Sure, which is totally fine. Like it is always possible to just remove a field of a type, right? And to add a new field, like we did for previous epoch participation in Altair, where we stored full attestations before, and now we switch to these bit fields, or the historical roots that got replaced with historical summaries. So that happened a couple times already, and if you use just a new field, it is possible with the stable container to just replace the old field with a whole so that no indices get reshuffled, and then introduce a new field at the end. That's fine.
Right. And I think this conversation just highlights, so, if you are curious about this EIP, we should probably start doing implementation work soon just to surface any of these things like Solius was talking about. So yeah, please take a look. And yeah, otherwise, nice work on the DevNet. And yeah, is there anything else on that? Otherwise, we can move to PureDOS. Okay, PureDOS. So there was a ton of progress over interop on PureDOS, which was very exciting to see. Is anyone here on the call who is closer to that and could give an update?
I could say a few words about PureDOS DevNet 0.
Sure.
So we launched PureDOS DevNet 0 during the interop event. Since then, we have reached an unfinality event, and we have about 14% participation. I think a lot of clients have discovered lots of issues in the first DevNet, and we could potentially relaunch anytime when we have something substantial.
Okay, sounds good. I mean, I think especially given how early it was and it being the kind of first DevNet for PureDOS, that's to be expected. Um, yeah, I think that then just kind of teases us up into the next big question, which is, do we want to include PureDOS in Electra? And generally thinking about the scope for the fork, I think we'll all be happier in the future if we can finalize Electra as soon as possible, possibly even today. So yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on including PureDOS given the recent progress? There's some stuff in the chat. Let me take a look. But yeah, I mean, maybe to kickstart the conversation, like I think there's a chance that we could ship Pectra this year, kind of as is. But then obviously that probably means that we'll do PureDOS in the fork after, and then that could be sometime into 2025. Otherwise, we could say, hey, maybe it's like a bit more of a lift, but we could reach and include PureDOS in Electra. That would delay Pectra some amount of time, but I think it might be worth it. Yeah. Does anyone have any strong feelings about this?
Yeah, I had a question. Wasn't the plan to like decouple the PureDOS fork from Electra? So you'd set Electra at epoch X and PureDOS like 2 months into the future, but we would have like a point where all clients agree that this particular epoch is when PureDOS gets activated.
Right. So you mean like a CL only fork?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's the same as including it, just with a delay. Doesn't really matter. Like the point is that all the users have to upgrade before that point in time. So we'd have to decide it with the hard fork.
Well, there's also the EOF stuff, and there are the SSE transactions, which are also they could be combined with PeerDAS so that it's both EL and CL, right?
Right, but then that kind of opens the fork scope quite a bit, and that almost suggests that there's a fork after Pectra where we do all of this, which I think was kind of the original thinking. The question is just, yeah, what other things do we delay, and how quickly can we get to this next fork after Pectra, and all of these types of questions.
Do you know from the ELs whether, like, how important is it that they do Verkle in isolation without any other changes? Like, as I understand, Verkle only touches the state trie and some consensus tracking there, like some data structures there, but are they willing to add orthogonal features, or is it like if we have Verkle, it has to be alone and everything that's not in there in Pectra has to come after, or what's the sentiment there?
I think that's generally the sentiment, that Verkle would be an independent thing. Guillaume, you have your hand up.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing is, for example, EOF can definitely not ship with Verkle because it touches the exact same. Okay, some of the state that is being touched by Verkle will also be touched by EOF. When it comes to what's the name? When it comes to SSD roots, that doesn't really matter because it is indeed completely orthogonal. Same thing with PeerDAS, by the way. If it doesn't really touch the state, it doesn't matter as much.
So the only thing that would have to come before is EOF, or like if it's not in there before, then it would be after Verkle, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's not the only thing, but it's one example of such thing that either has to go before or after.
Yeah, ATD.
Yeah, so my broad feeling is that the stuff that we currently have planned for Electra are kind of unexciting and not worth bothering, everybody's time with. So I'd be very interested in getting PeerDAS in just to have something interesting to ship in it. A lot of the work is also kind of, it feels unfinished at this point. Almost every EIP that we've done for the DevNet Zero, it felt janky and undeveloped. We did a lot of discussions and changes in Kenya to them, where we changed literally quite significant things about them, or should at least in order for them to be good EIPs. So I think throwing PeerDAS in there is in line with like polishing the existing EIPs, polishing PeerDAS, and then shipping like a really interesting hard fork that users will be happy with rather than just, some cosmetic changes like, where do withdrawals come from?
Right. I mean, the one caveat or pushback I think to that is just MaxCP as a big thing. I personally lean towards including PeerDAS and Electro myself, just because I think we'll be happier down the line, even if it delays Pectra by a bit. That being said, Pectra is already quite big, just in terms of a variety of cross-layer things, and that means more risk, much more to test. Maybe not so much a complicated rollout, but definitely increases like security and testing scope. So that's something to keep in mind for sure. Dragon, you had your hand up.
Yeah, hello. Just want to say that EL clients are mostly positive about the inclusion of EOF inside Prague, but having two forks seems okay. Just want to say I'm not sure how much complexity is there. We have it two forks in regards just having everything inside Prague and just pushing it for like 3 months. Just want to mention that.
Thanks. Nishant, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so I would also be in agreement with adding PeerDAS to Pectra. I feel like it's quite separate from the other EIPs that we have, so it's easy enough to test separately. Also, I don't think this fork is going to be small, so adding PeerDAS, which we have already had quite a bit of work on, I think is fair.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's kind of separate. I would say that having one fork 2 months after the other is kind of insane. If we're going to coordinate everybody upgrading their clients, we don't want to coordinate everybody upgrading the clients again 2 months down the line. That's like not enough time to even, go through a release cycle often. So that means that all the features that we would have in the +2 month fork-ish, they'd already have to be there in the previous one. And then it's just a technicality whether we call it a fork or not. Everybody, like, I don't really see that working.
Right. Solius, I think you had your hand up next.
Yes. So if there is strong consensus on adding PeerDAS to Electra, then I just wanted to check temperature. Maybe it makes sense to remove the attestations refactoring. But which exactly it was the one that moves the index makes everything makes a huge refactoring. So because I think it also falls under this not so exciting features, which was previously in this chat in this call discussed. So is there a strong against removing this huge refactoring if PeerDAS is added? Because I think it's good if PeerDAS is added and we have this huge attestations refactoring, and during the interop there was some good ideas that I agree that if attestations refactoring is done, then maybe we should combine that with stable containers, because anyway it's a huge change. So I would like to hear reasons against not removing attestation refactoring if PeerDAS is added.
Right. So you'd suggest take out 7549 and essentially swap with PeerDAS.
Yeah, that would be my solution.
Right. I mean, and then you could imagine in the next fork on the CL, we do that change along with all the stable container stuff. So that might be
that would
a
be
little
my
better. Yeah.
That would be my suggestion, because at least for myself, it looks just two huge things if we add PeerDAS and stable containers at one fork soon.
Anyone have any thoughts on that? Swapping PeerDAS for the attestation EIP?
I think the attestation one is like a lot of code and community changes, but it's not really impactful from a security point of view. I find them kind of orthogonal. It's just a massive pain in the ass, and maybe not that much utility, and that would be the reason to not include it. But I don't think it conflicts or interferes with PeerDAS in particular.
But in terms of utility, I would say that we discussed it in Drop that there are very good side effects of having that included, which is much more space in block and better reorg handling. So
yeah, that was the one reason to have it, and I agree with that. But like, it's also like a lot of work for the community.
Which has been, well, for us has been already kind of done for probably most of the client already implemented, excluding the APIs. But if we have enough time to also include the stable container with it, I see it as I guess a good thing.
Yeah, my point was more not to link it to PeerDAS. I would link it to stable container and do both in one, because they indeed are very linked. I do think that change needs a few more improvements. I don't think it's ready in its current shape. I do think that the confusion between the network form of attestations and the on-chain or in-block form of attestations needs addressing at type level and a few things like this. But if we throw in stable container, I think we might as well do the attestations as well, and it doesn't really add a significant burden.
Do you mean that we should rather have a different attestation type for network and for the on-chain?
Yeah, totally. And also for the single attestation, single voter topic, so that when you create an attestation with just one validator signing it, we should have that as a separate type, because then we can have the validator index there instead of the index in committee, which means that we can increase security of the gossip validation, or at least reduce, make it easier to validate those. And that's quite a win because we have a lot of attestations to process.
Yeah, so you mean you would not need to have a state to compute the shuffling in order to validate this attestation?
Yeah, I could pick out the public key without the shuffling and do that before the shuffling. And that's always good.
Yeah, but what would be the reason to have different types for network aggregate and for on-chain aggregate? I don't see the argument, the points on the single attestation, but the other.
They are semantically different. So you interpret them in different ways. One of them has a large list. The other one has a small list. It's just very easy to confuse the two in code flow. So in doing security audits on the code base, regardless what happens at the spec level, we are going to do two types for them just to keep them apart. And there's really no benefit of having the same type for them. Like the network variant, it kind of it appears in places that are completely separate from the on-chain version. So there's no spec burden. It's just it's not increasing complexity, it's clarifying complexity in my eyes to have two types.
Yeah, see, I honestly thought that if we have just one type and we can reuse it here and there, that would just reduce the complexity. But if it's not, just sorry, Sean.
I was just gonna say, in Lighthouse we had a few bugs that probably would have been avoided if we had separate types.
I don't see any big problem from the spec perspective to introduce separate type. I mean, like to have the old attestation for the old attestation for the network aggregates to keep it, and to introduce the new one for on-chain aggregates.
Enrico, you had your hand up?
Yeah. So having a single type, I see that is more future. So open up a possible future in which we don't have to change the type, and we enable earlier aggregation if we change the way we do that. I mean, we don't force to have only single committee aggregation in the first place, and you could potentially have very different way of aggregating in early stage. So the type will be exactly the same.
my feeling is that in order to do that, we would have to have a hard fork and introduce some kind of incompatible changes. Also, because the gossip rules dictate that we have to send single vote attestations on that topic. So, like, anything that only goes on the network is entirely ephemeral, and this only affects the encoding of the object on network on one topic. I feel that it's entirely discardable, this type, in any future hard fork, like the single attestation, and the same really for the aggregate.
Yeah, I see your point now. So the only thing that is really matter is what goes on chain, and the other thing is just SSD types that are floating around network and doesn't really affect the validation of block.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So to summarize a bit, if we see that introducing the on-chain aggregate separate type for it and to not change the attestation data type and use it for network aggregates as it is today would be easier, would alleviate some engineering complexities and potentially reduce the risk of introducing bugs, then from my perspective, it should be relatively easy to do on the spec side. So if we come to agreement on that, so I would be open to do this change.
Well, I'm in favor.
I'm in favor theoretically, but on practice, I don't know how much will be the code base of tech will be affected by such a change. Might be painful, but I don't know at the moment.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way as Enrico, where it's like it seems like it would have made more sense from the start, but now it's like we've sort of hashed all this out and would have to redo a lot of work to support it, but I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to think on it more.
Yeah, it's kind of a roll back on some things, and then we already have felt the pain of making this working, and yeah, I have mixed feelings.
I've thought about this a bit, and this change mostly affects the gossip layer. The reason I want to do it is really the single attestation security argument. Like, I really like that one.
Yeah, I like that one as well, to have the validator index in there. It's much better.
Okay. I feel like we kind of went off on a bit of a tangent on the attestation thing. Is there a place we can follow up async on this topic? Because then I kind of want to jump back to the chat.
Mikhail, if you're able to make the PR, I can commit to making the change in Nimbus, and then everybody can look at the code and see how much it changed.
I mean the PR to the spec.
Yeah, exactly.
Try it out.
Or if that's too much, Miguel, even just like an issue with the change that you can just describe, that would even be a good starting point.
Yeah, but I think it should be relatively easy.
Okay, great. There was a lot of chat in parallel, and essentially we were discussing two forks versus one. Does someone there want to maybe explain what they mean with two forks? Like, is this essentially keeping Pectra as is and then just putting pure DOS in a fork after? Or were we talking about something else?
I thought that's what we were discussing, but sorry, I thought that's what we were discussing, but then people were saying an even smaller fork than Pectra, and I'm not sure what that would even represent.
Yeah,
so that's maybe where.
Okay. I also kind of lost track through all the chat. So maybe people had different ideas of what two forks meant. Does someone want to argue for a specific two fork configuration?
Us here at Lodestar, we did publish a blog post in regards to a two fork proposal. Basically, we just want to keep the scope of Petra with most of the stuff that we've already implemented as is and try to ship something within 2024. And then the stuff that's being worked on in parallel, which still has like implementation details and stuff that needs to be worked on, which would delay having a 2024 fork, would hopefully go into this second fork, is sort of the way that we've outlined it. So that will include stuff like Pure DOS and yeah.
And how about MaxCB? Sorry, I don't have your post ahead of me, but
I'll repost the link. But
thanks.
MaxCB is mostly it's just like slight implementation details outside of consolidations, I believe, that needs to be worked out. But that would get included in 2024 in the first fork. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you'd also want to add some SSD stuff, but yeah, generally keeping it as is.
Correct. Like we were advocating really for stable container to really get pushing this first fork because some of the teams like Nimbus and us have already implemented it. Didn't take too much work, in our opinion. So that's why we were pushing for that to get included in the first fork.
Okay, so then we could imagine essentially Pectra as is with the intent to ship this year. Then there's Pectra Part 2, which is really just whatever the F star Osaka fork is. And then that would have Pure DOS, but it might be mid next year or later, right? And I guess that's kind of the decision to make is like, how okay are we with having Pure DOS potentially roll out, much later?
Much later than what, sorry?
I just feel like if we said, okay, Pectra this year and then Pure DOS in the next fork will probably be a year from whenever Pectra ships, right?
We can tell ourselves it'll be 6 months.
Right. And so, I mean, I guess that's
a hard fork.
Right, but the time between that one and Chapella was quite long.
I mean, in the EL, I think it was Reth that raised a good point, which is basically that shipping in November is bad, so we'd have to ship it before November, and that's tight. And PeerDAS is like a really exciting feature compared to pretty much most of the other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Also,
mean, go ahead.
one thing I do want to mention is that if we are thinking about splitting it into two forks, we have to be really careful that we don't then just overload the next fork with new EIPs. Yeah, I have no idea if we're ever going to be able to do that, if we can actually commit to something a year and a half in advance, because we're always coming up with new ideas, priorities change, and so on. So yeah, there's also an argument to be made if, for example, we swap MaxCB and PeerDAS so that there's more focus on PeerDAS. But yeah, I think those are all just points I wanted to have out there.
Right. I mean, we can commit today to saying, hey, only Pure DOS in the F star fork. But as you point out, we'll feel differently in 12 months. I mean, I do think having less stuff in one fork is better, right? So everything is like severely de-risked if there's two versus one. And that does argue for Pectra essentially as is. And then having pure DOS in the next fork. We just have to be okay with the world where, it's next summer before we get pure DOS.
Or work faster.
Yeah, we should probably always be working faster. Francisco says that sounds like a pretty bad world. Talia says in the chat, if PureDOS is so exciting, we should focus on that. So then, that gets us back to Pectra with PureDOS, and then the question is, do we want to make PureDOS smaller by swapping something out? And then the question is what?
Yeah, my argument would be that we still have some debate on multiple apes in Pectra. The good thing about PureDOS that it's one thing, not multiple. So if the focus would be shifted completely to PureDOS, then I think PureDOS could happen soon. But if we keep focusing on Pectra piece and then in parallel on PureDOS, I think this is maybe something that keeps us dragging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Ansgar is basically suggesting we include PureDOS and then reevaluate down the line, which might be a good way forward.
I guess from the spec and testing side, what I'd like to better understand is it more work to combine these things in one spec and then split them out if it takes too much time, or is it less work to have them be two forks and worst case activate literally at the same epoch or one epoch after each other? My sense is untying everything will be much more work than having two clean separated things that we want to merge. And if we don't even want to merge them, we can just activate them. I don't know if on the same block probably causes some weird issues, but you could literally do one epoch after, or 8192 epochs after or something, but have it in a single release from a user perspective. On the EL side, we've had bugs historically when we take stuff out. Things end up interacting with each other, and it's a non-trivial amount of work to safely remove something. So yeah, I'm not a client implementer, but my sense is it might be easier to spec them as two forks and decide later on if we want to ship them combined. Yeah.
Yeah, I
But
think
curious
the
what,
issue is having
Brian.
one fork dependent on another. I mean, CL teams, please chime in, but I think that would generally be the catch. But maybe we decide it's kind of worth the pain.
Because it means you can't test anything on Pectra until you have stable specs or anything on PureDAS, sorry, until you have single finalized specs for Pectra.
Yeah, any change in the prior fork is going to impact the fork after.
These two, PureDAS versus rest of Pectra, I think are pretty segmented though. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't think of interfork dependencies there.
Mm-hmm.
But that would typically be an issue, but I can't see it here.
Right, so we'd have Pectra as is, and then just for sake of argument, there's the F star fork in the CLs that's essentially off of the Pectra stuff, and then F star has PureDOS. Does anyone feel?
We kind of had this scenario also with 4844 and Chapella, where we wanted to ship 4844 in Chapella and then we pulled it out. So maybe client teams can say if that was in retrospect a good idea, or if it would have been smarter for us to have just waited. Because we're kind of agreeing on doing the same thing right now, right? We're saying we'll ship everything together and then a few months decide if we have to rip something out.
With the caveat that it
I
would be in
mean,
a separate fork, so it might be a bit easier just to have it disabled.
I'm going to put this in real easy terms for everybody, which is basically that we're trying to pack a block here, right? Which transactions go in. And the way you pack transactions is whether they affect each other, right? And I think pretty much everybody is agreeing here that PeerDAS is kind of orthogonal to everything else. So like it doesn't conflict with any other of the transactions that we're trying to pack into this block. And that's the main reason why shipping it together with this fork makes sense. Whereas some other changes that, you know, have complex interdependencies perhaps should go out. That's why we wouldn't ship, you know, Verkle and EOF and everything in one. So in those terms, I think all the items that are on DevNet 0 plus PeerDAS plus stable container nicely can be tested almost isolated until they're just put together, and we shouldn't see much risk in putting them together.
So that's a suggestion for Megafork, including PeerDAS and Pectra, and then just charging ahead.
Yep.
Yeah. Barnabas?
Yeah, my point for testing PeerDAS and Pectra at the same time is currently they are being activated at a different activation fork epoch, and we could keep that potentially even till we hit Pectra. So what we could do is keep these two features absolutely separate till the last second, and then we would just activate it on the same epoch in the end. So instead of triggering the PeerDAS on Pectra fork epoch, we would just trigger it on its own fork epoch. So this way we can, even in the last minute, we could just decide, hey, we are not ready with PeerDAS, let's delay that, and let's not include that in the Pectra fork epoch.
Right. So is everyone okay implementing it that way, where essentially there is Pectra and then there's a separate epoch for PeerDAS activation, and then we can
This is
decide down the
already
line.
the case. This is already the case right now, so nothing really has to change.
So
Right.
it will be effectively a parameter of the Pectra network.
It could be. I mean, it could also not be. Like, it's not today, right?
Yeah, so I think this would be the best way going forward. We say that we want to include it, and we see how client teams are done with the implementation, or they are not done. And if they are done by Pectra time, then we include it, and if they're not done, then we just delay it.
I think the complicating part in this is that both Pectra as well as PeerDAS would be rebased off of a DNAP starting point, and both Pectra and PeerDAS are changing at the same time. So one of them would have to be rebased on the other once it's considered complete, I guess. So it depends on client teams if that's an easy thing to do or if it's a hard thing to do.
Since we're not changing consensus types in PeerDAS, it doesn't seem hard to me to rebase the two. So
Yeah, so same for us. It's purely a networking change, so it can be cleanly separated or joined together.
But one question there wasn't PeerDAS changing fork choice as well? Because there's now sampling before a block is considered valid, as opposed to right now the current paradigm being that you get all the blobs and then it's valid. So wouldn't that touch some amount of consensus code and not just networking?
But the current Electra code or current Electra spec does not touch any for choice code. So that part is completely independent.
Well, for PeerDAS, it only just touches justification, so that'll be the only edge case.
Okay, so then suggestion would be to have Pectra as is. There's now a separate fork epoch for PeerDAS, but then PureDOS is on top of Pectra, not Deneb. Does that sound good to everyone?
I think there were arguments where introducing an entirely new fork in client code is difficult just for one feature. So I think
Yeah, that's why I was
kind of
thinking
iffy.
it was not an actual fork, but
Yeah,
actually
not an
some
actual fork.
a feature that enables at a particular point in Electra fork. It will be something like that for tag,
that could work.
hopefully.
Okay, so it's
But
all
not an
Pectra.
entire new fork.
Right, it's all Pectra, but then there's just a different fork epoch for
No,
PureDOS.
not a fork epoch.
Enabling epoch.
Yes, a feature enable epoch. Peer does epoch enable, and
Why?
everything.
Why is
Well,
that different? Like on the
be-
CL clients?
because when you do a fork, you actually have completely different domains and signatures and everything. Everything changes. So it's
We're
a
doing a
completely
soft
separate.
fork or we're Bitcoining it. Yeah, so we'd have to like resubscribe to different gossip topics, for example, change how we
Exactly.
sound, and like
Okay, got it. Okay.
usually change types, but since there's no types changing here, that's why we can do this.
Just running this through, what happens if we do end up putting PureDOS in F star? Is that going to cause any issues if we go with this approach that we're discussing right now?
I think it would be pretty easy to bump it out with this
Right.
approach.
Okay.
So what you're saying is like you can do PeerDAS as part of Pectra with a different activation epoch. This saves you the like overhead of all the new fork implementation details. But then if we wanted to move PeerDAS to its own separate fork, the only additional work is effectively that like fork scaffolding overhead. Is that right?
Like I mean, scaffolding overhead would be required by the new fork anyway, so it's kind of like
Right. Yes. Yeah. So it's like we can hold off on doing that implementation work until we decide, basically.
yeah. Like from my perspective, if we just have Pectra as a separate enableable epoch or whatever, we can either set it to the Pectra epoch or disable it and then just like wait till we implement F star on top and then just set it to the F star epoch.
Yeah, makes sense.
One thing though is, like, I think, especially if we do it a fork quickly after the Electra epoch, I guess if we don't do it as separate forks, we run the risk of people being able to run a Electra client that isn't PureDOS enabled by the time the PureDOS fork happens.
No, I mean, the code would have to be there in Electra if we. I feel as if what we're saying here really is that we want to provisionally put it into Electra, but it's easy to pull out if we don't want it in Electra. That's like the story we're selling. And from a technical point of view, the way we solve that is with a separate constant for PeerDAS activation epoch.
Right, which I think maps onto the thing everyone wants on this call today.
So then, I guess the takeaway is that we do rebase the PureDOS spec on top of Electra for now, and then we can decide whether to combine it later.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, we
but
would just have this activation epoch, and then that could be whatever we want.
the constraint that introduces is that PeerDAS must come after Electra then, I think. Something tells me that makes sense.
Well, after equal,
Like
right?
the epoch.
Which is what we're going to have either
Yeah,
way.
after equal. Yeah.
Is it an actual problem though?
No, it's not a problem. I'm just saying that like for the fork rules to make sense, that PeerDAS epoch would have to be higher or equal than whatever we use in Electra epoch in testnets, for example. which is fine. It's totally fine.
Terrence?
I think there's one thing that we probably miss that we should be careful of is that when you activate Electra before Peer does, right? Like which four choice rule should you be using? Should you be using the four choice rule that is specified in Peer does, or should you use the four choice rule today, right? So that's something that's probably worth thinking about, and whether there is risk there by going either way.
Right, but don't you only change the implementation of is data available in the spec?
I haven't looked at the latest for sure spec. I suppose there's changes. Yeah, I think Francesco is best at answering that.
Saying no as in it's not that encapsulated?
Yeah, I don't think it. Sorry. Okay, is it okay now with the echo and
Yeah,
stuff?
you're good, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not just changing implementation is data available. It's a bit more complicated than that, but not really that complicated. Like I think someone already mentioned before, the actual peer sampling part of things is really basically restricted to checking for justifications. So it's something that like you have a lot of time to do and doesn't kind of really get in the way of the critical path. But there is a change in the for choice. So it's, yeah, there is something to consider there. I mean, I don't see what it would even mean to switch to the peer dust for choice before peer dust is live, because like you're not doing sampling and yeah, I think it would make sense to just keep using the regular for choice until you actually switch to the peer dust networking.
Okay. We only have a few minutes. Carl.
What are we gaining here by having it as a separate epoch after the fact? It seems to me we're just assuming the worst, that things might not work out timing wise, and putting in all the effort of splitting it ahead of time, which means you kind of have to just take the loss on that the time delta to implement separating them out anyway. It just seems like we take a pessimistic route for no particular gain.
Well, the
There
gain
are
is we want to ship Pector in time. Like it's like I think all we're really doing is just uncoupling this activation epoch, and so we could decide that's equal to Pectra, or we could have it later if we need the option.
And adding that option, like how bad is it to add that optionality? Because if it's not that bad to add that optionality, then truly it's not that bad to add it down the line. To me, this just seems like a thing that complicates testing and a bunch of client work and stuff between now and then. This is not something we've really had before, I don't think, for any features, or am I wrong?
I
So
think
I
the
think
difference though is you're saying you're adding like this huge new feature to the fork, and the base case shouldn't be it's gonna like ship super quick, you know, not gonna cause any issues and gonna go smoothly. Like the base case should be it's gonna add some complexity. There's stuff we don't know yet about it that we're gonna figure out. And it's probably easier to hedge, like not delaying all of Pectra because we've added this huge thing. And if we turn out to be surprised that like it's actually easier than we thought, which I don't think has ever happened for any like large feature, then we can couple it easily. But yeah, it does seem worthwhile to have like some separation to not tie the fate of everything else that has higher certainty to this.
I mean, fair. To me, it doesn't seem much worse than just stripping it out if we reach the point where this is not going to work. But if everyone disagrees with me on that, that's totally fine.
I kind of get what you're saying, and I kind of agree. You have like a little bit more flexibility where you can just like enable peer DAS at like an arbitrary epoch. Like maybe that's good for testing or something. But yeah, I get that we could just package it in this fork and we can do this work if it ends up not being able to do this work. Because the work to actually make it enableable based on the epoch is not much.
Yeah, like basically, doesn't it come down to testing? Like either we tie Pectra readiness to having PeerDAS adequately tested, and then we activate PeerDAS, or if we decide that like PeerDAS isn't ready, and then we don't have Pectra wait, then we need to implement PeerDAS as a separate fork just to force clients to update.
Sean?
Yeah, so with PeerDAS, do we also want to increase the target block count?
I think generally, but that's a whole different conversation.
Okay.
Okay, so to summarize, Pectra as is, there's some threads to follow up on the existing EIP set. We'll move ahead with PeerDAS with a separate activation epoch, with the idea being that it will go live in Pectra, and then we'll see how PeerDAS implementation goes to determine if, PeerDAS activates right at Pectra or maybe some later date. Does this sound good to everyone?
I think the 7688 still needs to be added to the list.
That was stable containers.
Exactly, yeah, the CL portion of it.
Do we feel confident that implementations will be ready?
I have a working DevNet.
Okay.
Everyone needs, right?
Yeah, I mean, that to me feels like something we could discuss on the next CL call. We're also at time, so we will close soon. I'd probably personally like to see a little more implementation progress across all of the production implementations before including it formally.
We have a Lighthouse implementation. Sorry, we have it in the library we use. We haven't yet tried to integrate it into Lighthouse.
Is anybody against including it?
The concern is just making the fork even bigger than it already is.
That didn't answer my question.
We haven't even started working on it, so it's a question mark for us.
Okay. We're at time. Why don't we table stable containers until the next CL call? And in the meantime, if you want to support the CIP, you should work on implementation. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We're at time. That was a lot of different conversation, but thank you all for joining. And yeah, I'll see you on the next call.
Thanks, Alex.
Alex.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah.